Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's chapter recap. My name is Corie, and I'm here with my husband, Matlock. Hey, Matlock.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to continue going through Isaiah.
Yeah, it's good. Today we entered the forbidden chapter.
Yes, we do. We end on it, actually.
Yeah, it's great.
So we are taking a look at Isaiah 36 to 53. That was our assigned reading for this past week. So let's jump in.
Let's do it.
Let's see what you missed if you fell behind in your reading, or get you test your knowledge, test your memory on what you have already read. All right, so Isaiah chapter 36. This is a very interesting chapter. In it, the invasion of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, his invasion into Judah is described. This action is also described elsewhere in the Bible, in the books of Kings and Chronicles. So this is a very biblically covered time period in Judah's history. So in one sentence here, the Bible describes the fall of dozens of fortified cities. So it can be easy to just pass over this first sentence here about Sennacherib's invasion of Judah. But we have to remember, this represents massive devastation to the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. So every fortified city, massive loss of life, massive humiliation to Jerusalem, to Hezekiah, and to the people of Judah who are left. All right. So the commander of Sennacherib, so his military commander, comes to Jerusalem, and he speaks here in Hebrew so that all the people can hear what he is saying, what Sennacherib wants to say to King Hezekiah. So obviously this is employing a type of psychological warfare, right? He's speaking in the common language of the people. It also implies that this is perhaps someone, maybe an Israelite who has already been, the Israelite kingdom has already fallen to the Assyrians. Like, how do the Assyrians know how to speak Hebrew? Potentially because of their capture of Israel. That has already taken place. But it's interesting what he says. And again, recorded here, recorded in Kings, and recorded in Chronicles. I want to point out to you something that really has struck me this year when going through it. So Sennacherib, through this commander, accuses King Hezekiah of actually offending God, of offending the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, the God of Judah, by tearing down the high places of Israel. Remember how Hezekiah had gone through the land and done a religious reform. So for this accusation that Hezekiah had offended God by destroying the high places, for that accusation to have weight, there must have been competing views still within Judah and within Jerusalem as how to best serve God, which of course tracks along with what Isaiah has been saying this whole time, right? He's been talking about how people are not following God in the right way, how they're following their own ambitions, their own passions, that they're not righteous, but they think that they are. Basically, people had become okay with following God their own way rather than God's way. Now, one of the reasons why this has really hit me this year is that today, I think this really applies to us today. This is a human danger. Today it's so interesting because in our culture in the West today, we are so obsessed with treating other people the way that they want to be treated until it comes to God.
Yeah.
And perhaps this is because God has no direct voice. He can't put on a sad face and say, "You offended me."
Yeah. In
the same way that another human can. But we decide somehow in the West, so many people, so many Christians have decided that we get to choose how to follow God, rather than following God the way that he has outlined. And this is a sin that clearly goes back to the beginning of time. And we see it over and over and over in the scriptures. And here is just another example. So I wanted to point it out from Isaiah chapter 36 today. Okay, so moving on from that, then the Assyrian commander, after all of those accusations, that's not the only one, he lobs a few other ones. He promises in Hebrew to anyone who is in Jerusalem at that point, anyone who defects at that moment, he gives an opportunity. If you want to walk away from Jerusalem, if you want to walk away from Hezekiah and join us, you will be treated well. Which again, this probably had more weight because he was likely an Israelite captive.
Right.
Military captive, because he was able to speak Hebrew. Okay. Isaiah chapter 37. So in response to this, Hezekiah goes to the temple in Jerusalem. He sends his men, his commanders, his officials to the prophet Isaiah for Isaiah to pray for this remnant. This is the last city, important city left in Judah. When Hezekiah receives a letter of demands from Sennacherib, he takes that letter to the temple. God gives a message to Hezekiah that Jerusalem will indeed survive this, that the small remnant will continue on. And then also in chapter 37, we get the culmination of that. So the angel of the Lord is said to go out and kill many Assyrian soldiers overnight. So much so that in the morning, Assyria actually withdraws. And then we're given an account of King Sennacherib's death, which is a historically verifiable account, mainly that his sons murdered him.
Right.
All right. So Isaiah chapter 38. This is written out of chronological order. We know because the Assyrian invasion has not yet happened, but it's interesting as to why. So let's look at what has happened here. So Hezekiah comes down with a sickness, and he's on his deathbed. Isaiah the prophet tells Hezekiah, "You're going to die." But when Hezekiah cries out to God, he asks God to remember how Hezekiah has always tried to be faithful to God, how he's always tried to follow God. He's tried to reform the nation to serve God. And when God hears Hezekiah's prayer, he sends the prophet Isaiah back and says, "You know what? Tell Hezekiah I'm going to extend your life by 15 years. And that I'm going to deliver Jerusalem from the Assyrian invasion."
Right.
So this is really like a precursor where Hezekiah's life circumstances they directly tie with the future of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So just as Jerusalem will receive a death sentence by Assyria, it's going to look really bad. They should die. At the last minute, God will save them miraculously and extend their life. But it's not going to be, you're going to live on forever. And it was the same with Hezekiah. Okay, Hezekiah, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I just ran my face into this mic. I'm sorry. I'm getting really intense. I love Hezekiah. I'm going to extend your life, but it's only going to be for 15 years.
Right.
All right. So it's a sign. It ends up being a sign to Hezekiah, showing him what he needs to do in the Assyrian invasion. All right. Isaiah chapter 39, this is another instance in Hezekiah's political life that really does reflect the future. God uses this to show us what's going on. So after his sickness, but before the Assyrian invasion, Merodach-Baladan, the king of Babylon. So the Neo-Babylonian Empire has not risen yet, but there's this king of Babylon. There's this brewing in ancient Babylon. He is a rebel against Assyria as well, and he sends envoys to Jerusalem and to King Hezekiah to treat them like allies, and Hezekiah accepts this partnership and he treats them as allies. He shows them, what wealth he's dealing with and the power that he has to wield for warfare. So he's making this peace treaty with Babylon. But Isaiah comes in and he prophesies that one day Jerusalem's actually going to fall to this Babylon that will rise as a result of Merodach-Baladan. And that some of the descendants of Hezekiah will be taken to the Babylonian courts and made into eunuchs. Now, eunuchs were castrated males, but rather than this being a position of weakness or inauthority, this actually, eunuchs in a king's court became eunuchs so that they could reach positions of immense power because they weren't seen as competitions to the king's descendants.
Right.
So they became adopted into the king's family. They couldn't found their own dynasties, but they spread the dynasty of the king.
Right.
If that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So, but the problem here is that it stops King David's dynasty through Hezekiah of propagating.
Right.
So that's why it was a bad thing. Hezekiah really doesn't seem to be mentally able to deal with this information. He just kind of goes, whew, well, it's not going to happen in my life. Right. And it seems so human. It makes me smile and just be like, yeah, he's dealing with so much at this point. He knows Assyria is coming. But I think what this weakness shows here, and probably why it's included in the scripture, or one of the reasons, is that it shows without a shadow of a doubt that Hezekiah was not the Messiah that Isaiah had prophesied. He's not, and that God had prophesied to David years ago. He is not the Davidic king that was to come. He had fault. He couldn't handle it. There was a lot of stuff, which, it may have been a rising suspicion among people who were really excited about following God, that here's this king, this descendant of David. He wants to unify Israel and Judah. He's enacting religious reform. He almost died, but he got brought back to life. Like all of these things, this fervor may have been building around Hezekiah. So it's recorded here. No, he did have faults just like everyone else. Okay, Isaiah chapter 40. This is all about how it's going back into prophecy now. So how God himself will be the one who calls his people back to the land, and he will bring them back like a shepherd. It goes on to talk about how absolutely no one and nothing can compare to God. The nations collectively can't compare to God. Idols can't compare to God, and how God, like a shepherd, again, will take care of those who trust in him.
There's one thing here
to
note of, and this happens several times throughout Isaiah, but Isaiah does say something really quickly. He says in Isaiah 40:31, he says there's a blessing for those who wait for him. Right. Now he says this throughout all of Isaiah. What the thing to take note of here is the concept of waiting for God, because this isn't a salvific sense. This is like on the day of restoration, God will make a new heavens, new earth. It's like this idea that there's a blessing for those who wait for him. And you think about that, and you're like, well, I know he's going to do it. But waiting implies patience and perseverance, expectation, anticipating the day to come, which is something that you do when you're waiting for your kid to come home from school or something. You're waiting for him to come off the bus. But it's like you're doing that every day, and this is in a greater sense. You're waiting for this day of the Lord to come, and the fact that waiting process is a part of what we're supposed to be doing as Christians. Yeah. Right? That is often taken for granted. But it's here. It's like there's a blessing for those who wait. Not just, I know he's coming. It's like you might know that. You might intellectually know that.
Yeah, and we're supposed to put a lot of stake in that.
Right.
A lot of stake in the fact that he's coming back and that justice is coming. Yeah. And it's painful and hopeful at the same time. Because you still have to go through life and deal with circumstances that you'd rather not deal with.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
But underpinning the Christian faith is that hope that not only are you not alone, God is with you currently and can give you the strength to deal with these things, but that all of these things will finally be dealt with one day.
Yes.
Right? So there's this hope, and it's a bittersweet, painful hope.
That's right.
But it's great.
Yeah, that's right. And I just wanted to make note of that. Just the concept of waiting is part of the Christian life.
Yes.
But it's not quite like a waiting around kind of thing. Is that what time is it now? Is it it's almost here?
Yeah.
It's like a patience,
anticipatory.
Right, expectations of it to come. And it's part of the salvation. It's part of the whole process. But anyways, that's all.
Okay. Isaiah chapter 41. So this is about how God is above literally everything. So he's above history. He's above warfare. It talks about how he's above the patriarchs of Israel. So Israel and Jacob are the chosen servants of God, nevertheless. And that how all of those in humanity who rage against Israel and Jacob will fail. they will be brought down because God himself is the helper of his people. And it talks about how Israel will be God's threshing sledge. So his tool of judgment to separate out the wheat from the chaff. There's a lot of really interesting things that we could get into when it comes to that imagery. It's Isaiah 41 also talks about how God is the God of the poor and the needy. And what's also really interesting in Isaiah chapter 41 is the prophecies, the true prophecies of God given through his true prophets are compared to the vague prophecies that come through pagan gods and idols. So there's a distinct difference between the prophecies that's talked about in Isaiah chapter 41. Okay, Isaiah chapter 42, the servant of God is introduced here, which is really interesting because this servant of God clashes with how Israel as a servant is described. Israel is supposed to be the servant of God and is a servant of God, but is completely contrasted here with this true servant of God. So Israel is a servant in need of rescue, a rebellious servant, a blind servant. But this servant of God, rather, he is unbreakable. He brings justice. He's faithful. He's not discouraged. His teaching about God causes the islands, so the far off places, to put their hope in God. God will make this servant a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, specifically to open blind eyes, to release captives. Now this, of course, again, we talked about this last week. It's both physical and spiritual. There's a song of praise to God, a new song of praise that is recorded here in Isaiah chapter 42. It's spoken of, I should say, in Isaiah chapter 42. And then again, it's brought back in Israel, the servant. Israel is not the servant of God that's being spoken of in Isaiah 42 because they're directly contrasted here. Israel, the servant, is the one who is blind and deaf because they don't pay attention or listen to the prophets of God, which is why they find themselves exiled and plundered and looted and broken. Isaiah chapter 43. This is all about how God will still be with Israel and Jacob through their exile. So these descendants of the patriarchs, these people of God, and God will bring them back to their promised land. God himself will gather them and bring them back. So then there's this brief history given in Isaiah chapter 43 again that goes back through God's relationship with Israel and Judah, showing their rebellion versus God's innocence in that relationship. Isaiah chapter 44. This is all about how God will restore his relationship with his chosen people and how he specifically will pour his spirit out on them. So even though this devastation that's come upon the people of God is not God's fault, he is still going to redeem it. He's still going to bring his people back. He is literally called Israel's king and redeemer in this chapter. And there's another, Isaiah always plugs this in here. There's a treaty against idolatry and the making of idols. Isaiah chapter 45, this is really interesting because it talks about Cyrus specifically. It names this man Cyrus and how God will anoint him to bring the exiles back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple that would be destroyed in the future. So in Isaiah's time, the temple is not yet destroyed, but the temple would be destroyed. And someone named Cyrus would bring the exiles back. Of course, we know from history, this is talking about Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire. So the thrust of this chapter is that though God would use a foreign pagan nation to destroy and judge his people, he will also use a foreign pagan nation to bring his people back. And it's still him, even though he's using people's different intentions. It's still him molding the course of history here. Isaiah chapter 46, this is all about the demise of the gods of Babylon. There's this image of the gods themselves going into captivity, just as they led other people into captivity, so they will be led into captivity. Isaiah chapter 47, this prophesies the fall of Babylon. What's really interesting here and slightly terrifying as a fellow human being is what God accuses Babylon of. Essentially, you did not consider the things that happened. You attributed your own success, everything that happened in your life, to your own greatness. That's a little scary. It's a little scary. When everything is going well, there is a human tendency, when everything's going well in our lives, we don't seem to think much about God at all.
Yeah.
I'm doing this.
Yeah.
God is blessing me because I'm doing this.
Right.
So God is blessing me because of me.
Right.
Right? This is neither a good nor a sustainable attitude for us, and we learned this from Babylon. Yikes. Okay, Isaiah chapter 48. This is all about what Judah claims to be versus what they actually are. So what the people of God are saying about themselves versus the reality of the situation. So they're saying that they're relying on God, that they're citizens of Jerusalem, the holy city. But what they are in reality is idolatrous and stubborn. They're following their own ways. They are God. They are their own idol because they're following their own ways and rejecting God's word and ways and changing his word and ways. Isaiah 48 talks about how God has told them all of these things in advance, specifically so that they cannot attribute it to their idols. So prophecy, the role of God's prophecy in all of this,
right,
is to bring truth. Isaiah chapter 49. Okay, so this is again going back to this ministering servant that we have met earlier. So God, through the ministering servant, not through the blind servant Israel, will himself redeem the people of God from their sins.
Right. So you already have that contrast. There's two servants being made.
Yes.
And we'll get to that later. But
it's important. It's an important distinction because it's here in 49 and it is also back in 42.
Yeah. And yeah, the distinction between there are two servants being mentioned because one side tries to argue that we'll get there. We'll get there.
Couple
I'm
chapters,
getting ahead of myself.
Okay.
Sorry.
Isaiah chapter 50.
All right.
Isaiah chapter 50 outlines and symbolizes Israel's sin against God. And it talks about the servant's faithfulness, the servant of God's faithfulness, again, as this contrast. So the servant of God is submissive to God, whereas Israel was rebellious. The servant of God submits himself to suffering at the hands of others and waits for God's vindication. So there's a lot of messianic prophecies about Jesus here that start to really pour out, beginning in 49, but here in 50 specifically.
Right.
So Isaiah 51 then, this is a call to everyone who is in Israel, who are hoping in God to actually look back to Abraham. Look back to your forefather. So Abraham and Sarah were barren, and yet God multiplied them. He made them many. So God is going to comfort Zion. He's going to accomplish what he set out to do, what he said he was going to do in the first place. Salvation will come for the people of God and for the Gentiles. It talks about not being afraid of mankind. Because God's righteousness and his salvation will survive.
Right.
And then there's this call, there's this cry out to God, please make this happen. Please bring this to fruition,
right.
God.
In verses 9 to 11 of 51, there's this beautiful collapsing of the beginning of time with the end of time kind of idea. So I'll just read it to you. We can talk about it. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake, as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. All right, so we have this like condensing of like the beginning and the end of time kind of thing, of things together. But what's really interesting here is that you have the sea again, which represents with the place of the dead, Sheol or something like that, and Rahab, who's inhabiting this place, and that those who are ransomed by Christ who are redeemed, passing over that sea. That's just like a very beautiful imagery. It's almost like it was all from the beginning, like created this way. Mm-hmm. So they create this like beautiful imagery, like, and at this time, because when you have here, long ago when you defeated the great sea dragon, right? But then it also says you made a way for them to pass over, and they're going to pass over, and all the tears will be gone. So it's like you have this thing where it's like God's hand from the beginning of time to the end of time is all put there, and it's using symbolic language, of course, with Rahab the sea dragon, which would be appealing to people of their time period, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, you have this just this really beautiful way of saying it. I think just wanted to throw that in there.
Definitely. It's always amazing the imagery that gets drawn out by the prophets,
right?
Especially Isaiah. He has a tendency towards it.
Yeah, that's right.
Loves it.
You're the redeemed are crossing over the sea of death. They're crossing over the place where Satan, Leviathan, the great dragon, was defeated. Mm-hmm. Right. So, anyways, just neat.
Very, very neat. Okay, so in Isaiah chapter 52, there's this continuing call for Zion, for Jerusalem, the people of God, to wake up, to awaken, and put on strength like a garment. Verse 3 of Isaiah 52 is amazing. You were sold for nothing, and without money, you will be redeemed. And then there's this joy described of the comforted people of God. So essentially, with the clothing, these people go from naked to being given garments of strength. And there's amazing imagery that goes throughout all of the Bible on clothing and how God clothes us when we are unable to clothe ourselves, to protect ourselves, and to cover our own sin, which is amazing. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 52 moves into the servant of God becoming the suffering servant. It begins in verse 13, but it continues on into Isaiah 53. So here is the last chapter we are going to be taking a look at today, which is Isaiah 53. So again, this is an amazing chapter. Christians everywhere, since Christ has come, we attribute this chapter to describing the ministry and the work of Jesus Christ. It's pretty amazing.
Well, so much so, it's so revealing of Christ that Orthodox Jews today call it the forbidden chapter.
Right, because it's too similar to Christ.
It's to Christ, so they don't teach about it. A lot of them don't teach about it in synagogues. They just kind of brush it over. And when they do teach about it, this is what we're kind of chiming out earlier. If they do teach about it, they say that servant, the suffering servant, is Israel, right, ignoring that there's two servants. There's a blind servant
that has already been established in the context of Isaiah.
Right. So they say, this is Israel who's suffering. But when you just read Isaiah 53, which I think we should just read it because it's amazing. Well, 700 years.
We can read parts of it.
Yeah.
Read all of it would be too long. You guys can read all of it. Yeah. I definitely recommend stop, pause, read, then come back.
That's right. 700 years before Christ. This is prophesied, but it's clearly speaking about a human individual.
Yes.
You can't make this a collective group. Like there's no way, there's no context you can fit that in. You
can try to fudge it in certain areas and certain verses, but not the whole thing.
Not the whole thing. You can't. There's too much happening here.
Verses 4-6 is classic. It's read all the time. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so much.
And even verse 10, like, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong.
And then you have
it just keeps going.
No, I know.
It's awesome.
Verse 9 is the kicker too. Like so, and they made his grave with the wicked and the rich man in his death. Here it is. Although he had done no violence, and there's no deceit in his mouth.
Right.
How can you say
It
that's
can't
Israel?
be. No.
It can't.
That's the
be.
whole point of the book of Isaiah is
Isaiah's
that
been
they
saying
were
time.
deceitful the
It's like
entire time
you're
and
literally
violent.
being judged by foreign nations because you've been deceitful. And so it's like you can't say there's no deceit in his mouth. So it's like this is clearly about the righteous one to come. Isaiah, and it's spoken of. Where is it? Like Isaiah 43 talks about it quite a bit. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I am the Lord, who besides me there is no Savior, right? It's like, I am the Lord, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King. So it's clearly pointing to this King, righteous one figure, right? I am the one who helps you, declares the Lord. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. And it even says the Mighty One of Jacob. Like it just kind of goes down the list. It's like, it's clearly speaking about this one man to come, the king that they're all expecting to wait for, right, is going to redeem them. So that you said earlier that Hezekiah, no, it's not Hezekiah.
Right. And so it makes sense where like all these prophecies are coming out at the same time and everyone's like, could this be Hezekiah?
That's right.
And Isaiah's like, no, look at this. And they're all like, right, not Hezekiah. But anyway, okay, so yes, read Isaiah chapter 53. Let us know what you think. If you have any questions or comments down below. I hope you have a really good week. We're going to finish up Isaiah next week and move on through the Old Testament. See you later.
Thank you so much for watching. We want to keep producing high-quality biblical content, but we can't do it without your support. If you feel called to support us, please click the link in the description under Donate. Your support really means a lot to us.